Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Wellsy Weekly Podcast, the show where I talk about anything and everything. My name is John, aka Wellsy, and today you are listening to episode 50. We did it, guys. We made it to 50. And I just want to start today's podcast by saying a massive thank you to everybody who's listened to any of the podcasts, supported me making the podcasts, and just enjoyed listening to me rant and witter on, because it's been awesome to make. I hope you've enjoyed listening to them too. I've really found an absolute joy and pleasure in making these kinds of podcasts. And my question for you today is, what was your favourite podcast? If you've listened to, some of the earlier ones, is that one of your favourites? Is it one of the more informative ones? Is it one of the ones where I talk about shenanigans? If you want to share your thoughts and opinions about all of that, let me know down below in the comments. That'd be much appreciated. And if you can't remember every episode, then there's a link to the playlist below in the comments. Or if you jump to the end of the video, I think there's a playlist link there as well. So today I want to share my thoughts and opinions about this podcast, what works, what doesn't work, and my journey of making these podcasts, because like I said earlier, it's been an absolute pleasure actually making these podcasts, and I did it and started it up for a number of reasons, and I'll just want to talk about that really. I also want to talk about how I actually make an episode and some plans for the future as well. Now, let me take you back to 2019, May 2019 to be exact. And basically, I had this idea. I wanted to make a podcast because people throughout my life have kept telling me you've got a good voice for radio. And to some extent nowadays, I actually believe them, I think, yeah, I do have a good voice for radio, at least a decent voice. And there was just a lot of other things that just prompted me to just do the podcast at that time. For starters, I did a course at university, or at least a module in radio production, which I absolutely loved. The final assignment was basically doing a radio show, and I thought that was the best thing ever. And I wanted to do a bit more of that, and I wanted to do it more often. I also wanted to improve my editing skills, because I do a course in music production or music tech, and it might help to actually be good at editing your voice and all that kind of stuff. So I thought making a podcast would be a good idea, because I just wanted to practice my editing skills, in terms of vocal production, as well as, practice talking in front of a microphone, because that can be quite a scary and intimidating thing, especially for a lot of people. If somebody puts a microphone in front of you, all of a sudden you freeze up and it's oh, what do I do? So creating this podcast has definitely helped with my confidence in front of a microphone, definitely my editing skills. If you go back to the original podcast or the first episode, it sounds very different to what it is now. That's because of some of the tech as well, but it's also my editing skills as well, which I'm glad to see I've made an improvement. And at the start of when I first created these podcasts, I didn't know how long I was going to do it for, how long I was going to keep it up, but I did make a personal goal of, if I can do it for 50 episodes, I'll be all good. So basically doing it for a year. That's what I was thinking, I can do it for a year and see how it goes. And we've made it. We've made it to episode 50. It's been over a year because of different things that I'll tell you about a little bit later on. But yeah, it's all good. I'm quite happy that I've managed to hit my own personal goal. It's a self-accomplishment, I think. And I like the fact that I can just share it with other people, just say, look what I've done. And kind of bring joy to people, because that's what I do this podcast for as well. I kind of entertaining people, and this podcast can help me, especially with different and crazy ideas that I have for a podcast. Some of the wackier ones, like Dr. Evil or my shenanigans and all that kind of stuff. It's all good fun, Now, going back to the first podcast, I just want to tell you how this podcast has kind of evolved. And the first one was very unplanned, I should say, sorry. And you can tell because I was very nervous in front of a microphone. There was a lot of umming and erring. There was no real structure to the actual podcast itself. I did no prepping for it, which in hindsight I probably should have. And I quickly realised that you need to actually plan a little bit more if you're going to do a podcast every week. But I also didn't want to be restricted by one area or one subject or theme. So, That's why the catchphrase is talk about anything and everything, because I'm not really an expert in one particular subject or area, but I do know a lot of small things about random things, if that makes sense. Or at least enough to like talk about it for about 10 to 15 minutes on a podcast. And it's not always just about learning something or me telling you about something in physics or science or comic books or something like that. I also have a few funny stories, like an ATM eating my card. That was not fun. That's about 3 stories thinking about it, all wrapped up into like 2 days. Oh, it's really funny. It could only happen to me though. It's like some of this stuff is like you just can't make up. Like being chased by a lamb over a packet of crisps. That is a story I like telling because it's just bonkers. It's just absolutely mental, and nobody could make it up because it's just so nonsensical. And I talk about all of this on podcasts, on different episodes, and it's kind of, from the first one, it's evolved a lot, I think. The podcast, the way it's structured, a bit more planning's gone into it, and I'd just like to share a little bit of the process of creating these podcasts, because just out of curiosity, if you want to know, and hopefully if you're still listening, you do want to know, so let's go through it. So, now I have several lists of ideas that I jot down. They're on my phone, they're in my little notebook, they're in my other notebook, on the computer. I've just got ideas for podcasts everywhere. And every week, usually on a Sunday, I'll choose something from the list, or if there's something particular on my mind at that moment, I'll use that and write an idea out. Then I'll write some bullet points down on what to say, because I don't want to make a complete script, but I do need a few notes to remind me of where to take the narration of the podcast itself. Like this one right here. I've actually got a Word document open. I've got a few bullet points about, say, how the podcast is planned, basically. And that's what I'm talking about now. It's just a few bullet points to, it's just a few bullet points to point me in the right direction, because I don't want to go off on a tangent and make nonsense. I want to have a little bit of structure in there. And also, if I completely script it, like word for word, then it sounds, scripted, and it doesn't sound natural, and that's not fun to hear, So the bullet points allow me to just expand and go off on track at certain points, but hopefully come back on topics of the day as well. So a typical podcast usually has like an intro bit where I just talk about, what we're going to talk about on that particular day. We've got the main chunk of the podcast where I just witter and ramble on and on about just like random things or whatever the topic is. And then I have an outro at the end where I just, summarize about what we've talked about, remind you of a question that I've asked, because I try to do that every episode. Because, I quite like to get people involved in these podcasts, And whilst I'm just sat here talking to myself with a microphone in front of me, I do want to get you lot involved as well. So I usually ask a question, hopefully try and get you to, interact with us so we can have a little bit of a conversation in the comments, in person, just have a bit of a nice chit chat all around. And especially when, I meet somebody in person and I don't know them very well, but they've listened to the podcast and they start having a conversation with me. That's quite nice to hear as well. Because in person, when you first meet me, I am quite shy and quite reserved. I think I am anyway. I just find it a little hard to actually talk to people, especially if I just run out of anything to say. But I think the podcast has helped me with that, I've had people tell me how much I've grown in confidence. I'm outgoing and a natural talker, which before the podcast, I would completely dismiss them. I was like, that's not me. That's not what I'm like at all. But now that I think about it, they might have a point. I can personally see the improvements of, in myself doing this podcast. I am a bit more confident. I am a bit more outgoing. I will be a bit more vocal to strangers. Although I feel like I go too overboard now and I just don't shut up. Especially when I went to archery, like the initial archery club. They were like, I was talking to some people trying to be friendly, and apparently my girlfriend could hear me all the way down the street just talking. So I was probably a bit too loud in that situation, but definitely my confidence has improved, I reckon, and it's all thanks to this podcast. As I was mentioned, once I've planned the podcast, then it's time to record the podcast. And recording usually takes anywhere between 10 minutes to about half an hour. Sometimes I just can't get my words out, or it just doesn't sound right. And other days it's just I've got to wait for my laptop to stop buzzing, because you can hear the laptop buzz in, my microphone. So I've got to wait for like background noises to quieten down a little bit. Or sometimes I just don't have enough to say either, so I try and fill it with absolute nonsense. And that's when it's non-scripted and it doesn't sound as well. And that's something else I struggle with, the ability for ideas to generate good ideas to talk about consistently. And this is where you lot come in. My question, or my second question for you today, just hit myself. So, yes, if you want to hear me talk about something in particular or ask me a question, feel free to, I'm always open to hearing people out, and I'd love to hear what people want to hear from me. Because it's all good me talking on this podcast about anything and everything. But if there's something in particular you want me to talk about, or you want my personal opinion on, by all means, call out to me, reach out to me, tell me what you want to hear. And it also gives me, some ideas of what I can talk about in the future as well. But back to the podcast making. So we've planned it, we've recorded it, it's now time to edit it. And I usually try to increase the lower frequencies or the bass frequencies of my voice just to get that podcast aesthetic. It's a really hard word to say, that aesthetic. Oh, maybe it's not so hard. Anyway, no, that's just trying to boost it, make it a little more boomy, a little more lower end, because you get that podcast feel from it then. And I also add something called compression, which is basically affects the dynamics of my voice. So when I speak quieter, it makes it sound louder and reduces the volume if I get too loud. So if I talk really loud, it basically brings them peaks down a little bit. And this is to, so you don't have to keep changing the volume when you listen to us. So it's just consistent levels throughout. And this is always being refined, and tuned each episode depending on what I say, how loud I talk, and hopefully improving my skills in voice editing as well, which is what I set out to do with this podcast. And finally, I add all of this to a video editor so I can publish it on YouTube. Now, I have tried adding, it to SoundCloud in the past, which is another platform which you can basically listen to original music to. I thought it'd be a good idea to put a podcast on there as well. But I wonder if there's any other platforms you could recommend for podcasts in particular. I might look up Spotify and see if I can get it on there as well. And if so, would you actually listen to it on Spotify? Or is there any other social medias or websites that you would actually want to listen to it on? I did get a comment in an older video, but I cannot find it for the life of me. And I'm not sure if it was deleted. So again, any suggestions would be kindly appreciated in this area. Yes. So, before I end the podcast today, I just want to mention some of the ideas I had for the podcast in the future. I have been contemplating actually whether I stop the podcast once we've reached 50, but to be honest, I really enjoy making these podcasts, it helps with self-motivation, especially in these unusual times, with lockdown and all that. And I think if I didn't have the podcast, I would have gone into a really depressive state like I did last summer. Because there was a brief moment or a couple of weeks in summer last year where I didn't do any podcasts and I had no motivation to do anything. I was very secluded from the world and it affected me mentally. It took me months to get out of this depressive state, and I still don't think I'm clearly out of it right now. But I haven't done that this summer, and I think it's largely because I have got kept the motivation and kept the momentum of this podcast going. If I didn't have this thing that I create, I wouldn't have any motivation to get up in the morning. I wouldn't have any motivation to, get out of bed, do anything, go see friends, visit friends, talk to people, So I think the podcast has really helped, in this time, in this weird time of lockdown, I say. So yeah, long story short, I don't want to end this podcast at 50. I want to carry on making them as often as I can. However, I was contemplating or thinking I might, rename it to something else, because recording it every week is very hard, especially when we get to a bit more busier time when I start my new job. And with the title being called Wellsy Weekly, I should probably release it weekly. However, I was wondering if I could do it fortnightly, so I have a bit more time to prep and research and create slightly longer episodes. and dedicate a little more time and to make them a bit more enjoyable for you at home. I'll post that question on Facebook in a few days probably and see what people think to that idea. I also wanted to have a new shout out section, so if you wanted me to give you a shout out or a pat on the back for something that you've done, you can, just so we can get a bit of appreciation from all walks of life and share the love, you know, because I think that's kind of important as well. And that's about it really. I mean, I'm also planning a nerdy podcast as well. That's not coming out for a few weeks because I just want to, you know, get that perfect, you know, get that really solid, you know, kind of themes and what I want to talk about. But that is definitely coming as well. So yeah, look out for that. It should be coming soon. Look forward to it. So I'll remind you that the question for today is, what was your favourite episode of the podcast? And I'm talking anything. Was it the podcast where I talked about being hustled by a granny? Was it the podcast where I was talking about ducks being evil? Was it the podcast talking about time paradoxes and all that kind of stuff as well? If you want to share your thoughts and opinions, let me know down below in the comments of this video. That would be much appreciated. So, thank you to everyone who has listened to every episode, some episodes, or even just this one. It's been an absolute pleasure just planning them, producing them, just the evolution of this podcast and saying it is my own creation. I think that's what I like the most about this podcast. So, thank you for listening. I hope you have enjoyed, and remember, enjoy a cuppa.